Lyle Campbell is currently Professor of Linguistics at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. Over the course of his career, he has held appointments in disciplines as varied as linguistics, anthropology, behavioral research, and Latin American studies. He has held visiting appointments at universities throughout the world and has been the recipient of numerous national and international grants, including 14 separate grants from the National Science Foundation. He is the author or editor of over 20 books and has written more than 200 articles on topics ranging from generative dialectology to Finnish vowel harmony to multilingualism and language choice. He is, of course, best known for his work in historical linguistics and language documentation, particularly of the indigenous languages of Mesoamerica. He received back-to-back Bloomfield Awards from the Linguistic Society of America in 1998 and 2000, and his 2000 book, American Indian Languages, The Historical Linguistics of Native America, is described as providing encyclopedic coverage of comparative and historical scholarship on languages of the Americas, with a critical assessment of methods and criteria of establishing language relatedness. Tonight, he will discuss his insights on a slightly different relationship, namely that of language documentation and historical linguistics, in his talk, which I think the title has changed to just Language Documentation and Historical Linguistics. So please join me in welcoming Lyle Campbell.
Is it on now? Take a second here. Well, thank you, Robin, for that introduction. I always hate those introductions. I always wonder who they're talking about. Let me start by doing something that's not in my talk. I think this might be our last opportunity, so I'd like to thank, on my own behalf, and ask you to join me in thanking the organizers of the Institute and the people at the University of Michigan that have made this possible, and in particular, thanking Andres, Robin, and Jennifer. Let's all thank them. I wish we could do more. Well, it's a real pleasure for me to be here. It's a great honor, and I feel really humbled to be among the recipients of the Collins Award. We were talking at drinks just before this about who the past Collins shareholders were, and there are quite a lot of them, and they're really great people. Some of them are friends of mine, some are here, some are heroes of mine from a long time ago. Almost all of them have done really significant things, but it's humbling and truly a great honor to be amongst them. So in recent years, I do historical linguistics, and I've also been doing language documentation, and I wanted to take this opportunity to try to talk about how they're related and see about the relationships among them. So that's the title, Historical Linguistics and Language Documentation. The goal of the talk is to explore relationships, can you see it all? Yeah, that's good. To explore a relationship between language documentation, especially documentation of endangered languages and historical linguistics, and to examine several ways in which they are interconnected, how they're mutually supportive, how they need one another, how together they contribute to our discipline. So what I'll do in the talk is the following things. We'll begin with some historical background, some perspective. We'll talk about why language documentation is important to historical linguistics. Talk about some claims that are made about what can happen, what kind of changes can happen to endangered languages. Then we'll look at language documentation contributions to historical linguistics. And then in the end, we'll look at, very briefly, some historical linguistic contributions to language revitalization projects. So let's start with some historical perspective. In spite of general perceptions, the comparative work on language families has almost always involved, has often involved both written languages with a long written tradition and languages for which we only have fieldwork data, recent documentation. I think the common view is that comparative method is some old thing that looks at old manuscripts of languages with a long written tradition, and I want to let you know that that's not the case, and hasn't been even from the very beginning. If we look at some of the best-known language families, Hawai'i, Hungarian has written text from the 8th century, but at the same time, the family has Munsian and Khanki and some Samian languages that don't have a written tradition at all and were documented much more recently in language documentation. Uralic is one of the best known language families. Look at Semitic, same sort of thing. Some of the oldest written documents are in old Semitic languages, but when we have Ethiopian relatives, Semitic languages of Ethiopia, where there's scarcely any documentation, and yet we can do comparative Semitic just fine. Austronesian is another case, large language family. It has written material in Old Cham from the 800s, Old Malay from the 600s, Old Javanese from the 9th to the 15th century. And yet we've got all these Austronesian languages in which the documentation is brand new. Some of them still have not been documented. There's a quote here from my colleague Robert Blust saying that about Old Javanese, however, Old Javanese had already changed more than many modern Austronesian languages, and the study of Old Javanese texts contributes little to higher level reconstruction that cannot be gained from the study of modern Javanese. What he's saying is that even having a written tradition doesn't always buy you a great lot, and that's something to keep in mind too. So let's look at some of our founding figures, maybe heroes to some of us, and to see where it goes. The comparative method has always involved, has often involved unwritten languages, so-called exotic languages, sometimes called primitive languages, even from its earliest times. So the Hungarian Jesuit mathematician, Johannes Sjanovic, published a very famous book in 1770, and he's considered the founder of the comparative method by many people. He went on an astronomy research trip to Lapland in Norway, in the Norwegian Arctic, and he devised an orthography for writing Sami and took down his own field method, his own field notes. And based on those data, he compared Hungarian and Sami and Finnish and proved that they were related and established the Finns family. And other people had talked about it, but his work really pins it down. And he also established the comparative method, at least in the view of many historians of linguistics. So it was important just to keep in mind that he was looking at written texts in Hungarian and Finnish, but also looking at field methods, field notes for Sami. It gets better or worse depending on your point of view. Here's a picture of the book. It says something like demonstration that Hungarian and Lap are the same, which means that they're all related. He decided if he was going to convince skeptics, he couldn't use his own field data. And so he went to the only data that was available. These were Lem's work. Lem had really bad Danish orthography, and all his glosses are in Danish, and Sjanovic didn't know Danish, so there was an obstacle there. But nevertheless, he used Sami Lap forms from Lem rather than his own because he didn't think people would go for the non-written stuff. So there's been a dialectic all the way from the very beginning about people's attitudes about written traditions versus the documentation information that comes in our area. So just to make sure that you don't miss how important Sjanovic was, he was so well known and so influential. He was cited by people over and over and over for centuries. But Rasmus Rask, of whom you probably have heard if you've hung around linguistics a long time, and will hear if you hang around longer, you'll hear of him. In 1818, he argued that his evidence for trying to show that Germanic was related to Greek and Latin, that is, pinning down Indo-European, should be considered convincing because it compared really well with Sjanovic's proof that Hungarian and Lappish or Sami were the same language, that is, they were genetically related. And he adds to that this proof, no one's denied this proof since that time. That was a picture of Rask. So if we ratchet it up 150 years to Edward Sapir, he's probably the hero of many, many linguists because he did it all. He did historical linguistics in a number of families, including Indo-European and Semitic, as well as lots of Native American languages. and published papers that were very important in linguistic thinking generally. And he did a lot of language documentation. So in his work on U.S. Tekken, in the early years of the 1900s, he used Nahuatl, which had a long written tradition, many, many texts and descriptions from the 1500s on, and he used his own field data from Southern Paiute. And so he was using both documentation and written tradition. And he proved that U.S. Tekken was related. He established the family. This is significant because at the time, Major John Wesley Powell had published his classification of the languages of North America, in which this was a starting point for Americanists for classifying languages in North America. And Powell had denied that U.S. Tekken was a language family. So Sapir was able to pin it down once and for all. So this does two things. It gives us U.S. Tekken, a really important language family, but also shows us that you can do comparative linguistics on languages like this, where not all of them are well recorded and have a long written tradition. So moving on, we've got Leonard Bloomfield, who, like Sapir, did lots of documentation, did lots of historical things on Germanic and European and other things, but and wrote important general treatises on the nature of linguistics. But he's also very famous for his both his field work and his Proto-Central Algonquian reconstruction. In his reconstruction of Proto-Central Algonquian, he used some data of his own, for example, from Menominee. You may have heard of Menominee if you haven't heard of these other things, because it's one of these books that's so important. People keep coming back to it to recast it in different theoretical frameworks. It was very influential research documentation. Bloomfield in 1925 published his very famous proof of the regularity of sound change in unwritten or exotic or primitive, so-called primitive languages. This was a major contribution to linguistics, to be able to prove that sound change is regular, even in these kinds of languages. So he demonstrated it was possible to do reconstruction on languages like this, even without written records and using some field data. This is kind of important because there were people around, some famous ones. I only put one quote here from Meillet, Antoine Meillet, but you can find others from him and from his colleagues and some others at the time, would sort of say something like this, that maybe languages in, native languages of America or Australia or somewhere just don't work. You can't do the comparative method. So here's one quote from Meillet and Co. in this really famous book, Les Langues du Monde, where, I'll read it. One may well ask whether the languages of America, which are still, for the most part, poorly known and insufficiently studied from the comparative point of view, will ever lend themselves to exact, exhaustive comparative treatment. The examples offered so far hold scant promise. It is not even clear that the principle of genealogical classification applies. So Bloomfield, in his proof, was directing himself directly at people who didn't think you could do the comparative method on languages that didn't have long written traditions. I'm going to go through some of Bloomfield's proof. It might be slightly technical, maybe not. If you don't get it, just hang in there a couple of minutes and then it'll be a punchline. And I think most of you will get it. So Bloomfield, in his famous proof, shows how insistence on written sources can actually be an obstacle, that sometimes you get better data from field data, from documentation data than you might from the written sources. So let's see how this works. Here's the part of Bloomfield's Proto-Central Algonquian, which is talked about. It has these 5 correspondence sets, and if you look at them, they're all made up of combinations of H and sh and S before K. So it's a few sounds, but they don't correspond in exactly the same way across the languages. So you have 5 different sets of correspondences. Well, he reconstructed something different for set 5 than all these others, even though set 5 didn't have new sounds that you couldn't find in these others. And he reconstructed something like for the Proto-Central Algonquian, believing that because sound change is regular, you couldn't explain these differences unless you reconstructed something different. and then saw how the changes worked in these languages. So this is based on believing in the regularity of sound change and believing that you need this additional reconstruction in order to account for these various differences. Well, later on they discovered Swampy Cree, and Swampy Cree had a different sound correspondence that didn't show up in combinations of these others. It had an HTK, and Bloomfield took this to be confirmation of his belief in the regularity of sound change, that in fact, indeed, you have now a witness that this set is different from all those others, and therefore you could reconstruct something different. So Bloomfield used written sources where he could, so he used written sources for Fox and Ojibwe, among others. And these were written by William Jones, who was a native speaker of Fox. Some of us were talking about William Jones a couple days ago. She can't see him too well. I put him up mostly because you kind of want to know that there's Sir William Jones and then there's this William Jones, and they're not the same guys. There are two of them in linguistics, which should be some kind of evidence that you can get accidental similarity across generations. Maybe not. Something to go home and tell people. There are two William Jones. Okay, well, he was from Oklahoma, and he was a native speaker of Fox. He studied the boys and went to the Philippines and got killed by headhunters in 1919. But because he was a native speaker, he wrote these things in these other Algonquian languages. Problem was that Bloomfield used his material, and as a native speaker of Fox, he didn't hear contrasts in Ojibwe that were there. So Fox doesn't contrast sk and sh and shk, and so he failed to get the contrast. Bloomfield then didn't see the difference until he got to Swampy Cree. Let me see if this will go back. Sometimes it messes up. Yeah, so because William Jones was a speaker of Fox, he only had shs, didn't have s's, and so he didn't write this contrast in Ojibwe, the s versus the sh. He just missed it. And so if you have sh here, then the only witness of all of these things being different is when you discover Swampy Cree as having an entirely different thing. And Bloomfield then later on figured it out, and so he says in 1946, 20 years on or so, almost, the fuss and trouble behind my noting language, 1928, would have been avoided if I had just listened to Ojibwe, which plainly distinguishes shk from his reconstructed from SK. Instead, I depended on printed records. This is William Jones's written forms, which failed to show the distinction. So the point of that was that older written materials are really great. We need to use them, we need to get as much out of them as we can, but they're not always reliable, and sometimes it's the accurate field reported data that give you better juice than you might have out of the written records. And that's what Bloomfield discovered here, that his own field data were better than the written records he was depending on. Well, so this is still in this historical perspective background thing, but Sapir and Bloomfield are amazing guys. They contributed to language documentation, to historical linguistics generally, and to general thinking about linguistics. I think then we can conclude that the kinds of cases we've been looking at show that there is a case to be made for the relationship between fieldwork documentation and historical linguistics. So, next topic, why is language documentation, particularly documentation of endangered languages, important to historical linguistics? We might ask, if we were talking to a general audience like this one, that weren't linguists, did you know that of the more or less 7,000 languages in the world, that over 3,000 of them, in fact 3,181, are endangered? And the reason we know that, that's 43% of all human languages. And the reason we know that is because we've done the catalog of endangered languages, which has very strict criteria about what qualifies as an endangered language. And so we've come up with this figure. That's sort of shocking, but it's not if you look at those projections and say that 50% to 90% should become extinct or doomed by the end of the century, something like that. Again, from the catalog of endangered languages, which I invite you all to go look at, there are 639 extinct languages that we know about pretty well. That is, these are ones that we can name and we know a little bit about. There may be hundreds or thousands of others that we can't be too sure of, but we at least know that there's this many that we can sort of get our teeth into in some substantive sort of way. Well, of these extinct languages, 227 of them became extinct since 1960. That's 35%. This means that of all the thousands of years that languages could have been going extinct, over a third of them became extinct in the last 60 years. This then validates the claim that linguists make that the rate of extinction of languages is highly accelerated. And I hope you feel shocked and will tell all your friends to be shocked at the rate of extinction that's taking place. More from the catalog. There are, by consensus amongst linguists in different parts of the world, about 420 different language families, including language isolates. And of those 420, exactly 100 are extinct. That is, all the languages in each of those families is gone. This means that we've lost 24%, let's say a quarter of the phylogenetic diversity in the world is already gone. So what does that mean for us as, not just linguists, but in particular as historical linguists? Well, extinction of individual languages is a monumental loss of scientific and human information comparable in gravity to the loss of whole species, say the Bengal tiger or the right whale. This is preaching to the choir, right? You all know that if a language goes extinct without documentation, there's huge amounts of information of all sorts that we lose. In this context, we're talking about the historical linguistic information we're going to be losing. But if you lose whole language families, as I was just talking about, 100 of the 420 are just gone, it's an unspeakable tragedy. It's comparable to the loss of whole branches of the animal kingdom, say to the loss of all felines or all cetaceans. Imagine attempting to work out the history of the animal kingdom with major branches gone, 24%. A quarter of all the language families are just gone. Well, what does that mean for us as historical linguistics, historical linguists? Well, it's really important to have the documentation. Without the data on these languages, we can't classify them accurately, and without being able to classify them, we just don't know major aspects of the history of humankind. We can't, without the linguistic data, we can't mine the historical linguistic facts that are there, so we can't compare by the comparative method, we can't use loan words, we can't find out what the migrations were, what the homelands were, what kind of contacts people were having. All those things that we learn by doing historical linguistics, all those facts, those real human historical facts that we find out about people and populations and about the entire world. We just lose that information entirely if languages go extinct and we don't have access to the history that those languages would tell us if we just had the data and could study them historically with historical linguistic techniques. So next topic, change in endangered languages. There's some claims or questions about what can happen in an endangered language. One is about the kinds of things that we, whether they're the same as normal, non-endangered languages or not. So one claim is that sound change in endangered languages doesn't have to be regular. Well, most of us believe that sound change is regular, or mostly regular. The answer to the question, is it regular in endangered languages, seems to be no. Probably shouldn't say seem. It obviously is no, depending on how you look at some of the following examples. So I'll talk about, everything I'm going to talk about in this talk is from documentation projects that we've been doing in places where I work. So all of these are basically my own work with some graduate students. So we'll talk a bit about the Xincan languages in Guatemala. This green part is for Xincan, there are 4 of them. And then Pipil is spoken in El Salvador, the blue stuff here. And we'll talk about some cases in both of those. So Humaytepeque, one of the 4 Xincan languages, some of the semi-speakers just arbitrarily glottalize everything possible in the language. So they have, in non-endangered Humaytepeque, there's a contrast between plain and glottalized consonants, but some of these semi-speakers just glottize everything. Well, you can't say that that's a normal kind of linguistic change, and it's just not expected in fully viable languages. You can't imagine that languages would give up all their plain consonants, end up with only glottalized consonants, and violate the universal that says the presence of glottalized consonants should imply the presence of plain consonants. The fact that they, in other cases, they can change something in some words and not change them in others just means that they're not undergoing regular sound change in these cases of endangered languages. At least not regular sound changes seen in the Neo-Grammarian sense. So that was one. Are the sound changes always regular? I think I muddled that example a little bit, but you'll see some more. The other question is related. Can endangered languages change in ways that non-endangered languages can't change? And the answer to that seems to be yes. So let's look at some examples. So back to Hawai'i, the Shinkan language. We already saw the example that some of these semi-speakers just glottize everything. That's not a change that you would expect in a non-endangered language. Typologically, it's just too far out. Goes against the grain too much. Now, moving to Pipil, this elegant map from Ethnologue shows you the Pipil area of El Salvador. And there are a bunch of different dialects. Teotepec is one, and highly endangered, just a few speakers left, if any now. There were only a few when I did the research. All of Pipil, when it's viable, has a rule in which all sonorants get devoiced at the end of words. So this L has a voiceless L allophone at the end of the word. So the word for chili peppers, cheese, which is where we get chili in English, with a voiceless L, cheese. And when it's not at the end, you get chiltik with a voiced L. And this is just chili colored. Tik is an adjective ending that tells you red is like chilies. So the bottom line here is that if you are a non-endangered, if you're a speaker of a non-endangered variety of Pipil, you'd have this rule that devoices sonorants at the end of words. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, in Teotepec, they changed every L to a voiceless L in all contexts, not just at the end of words. So here's a word for dog, peru, and they say perro, and chiltik, now with a voiceless L. Well, it's not impossible to imagine that some non-endangered language would do it. It's kind of a strain to imagine that you would go from a voiced L to a voiceless L everywhere and give up your rule, your allophonic rule. This isn't very good, but to orient you, here's El Salvador, and there's Teotepec, kind of in the mountains or in the Pipil area here. Okay, another thing from Teotepec and Pipil is what some people call acts of reception. This is where prejudices or evaluations of things in the dominant language get taken up by the speakers of an endangered variety. So in Teotepec and Pipil, when it's not endangered, they have a shrimp. This is a retroflex non-apical laminal fricative. It's like saying a retroflexed S, but make it a sh. So don't put the tip of your tongue up, put the blade of your tongue up. And this, turns out, is what is spoken in local varieties of Spanish. This is the equivalent of the trill R, so instead of saying roto, it's choto for broken, instead of rey, stuff like that. Well, this variety in Spanish is highly stigmatized, and because it's highly stigmatized in Spanish, the speakers Teotepec and Pipil just imposed the Spanish stigma on it and changed their sh to an R. They have no R's in Pipil, but now they're saying things like ruchit instead of shuchit. And this just sounds so bizarre. This is a change that you wouldn't expect in a natural language. I mean, you might imagine there's rhoticism where you change some S's into R's and maybe between voice things or something like that. But this doesn't look or feel like rhoticism. This just looks like a kind of change that shouldn't have happened, but has happened because of taking the valuation from Spanish and imposing it on sounds in this language. And there are a number of other examples like this, but I'll just give you one. So I put here overgeneralization. There are cases where semi-speakers just overdo it, where they're aware of unusual traits in the language, unusual from the point of view of the dominant language, which is their dominant language, but they haven't learned precisely where these things go, what the distribution of them is, like the voiceless L. And so they just get carried away and do it everywhere. So that's presumably why some of those semi-speakers of Humaitepec glottalize everything, make ejectives out of everything. And it's presumably why some of these PPL speakers make all the L's voiceless regardless of where they show up, the kinds of overgeneralization. Well, I think a lot of these overgeneralization changes in endangered languages are not going to be the kind that you're going to find in most situations where the language isn't endangered. So what does this mean? Is that, oh, blasted. I only proofread this about 16 times. No? Goes to show you see what you want rather than what's there. So does this mean we just throw out the regularity hypothesis and we don't think that sound change is regular anymore? I don't think so. I think it goes something like this. Given that the regularity of sound change holds well in non-endangered languages, we would not want to give up this valuable principle just because sometimes the speech of imperfect learners of endangered languages may fail to conform. Just as we wouldn't want to abandon the same principle if we found irregularities in the speech of adult second language learners or persons with various speech pathologies that didn't conform to the regularity. So I hope the point I'm trying to make is clear, that you might get non-regular sound change, but I don't think that means that you give up the principle of sound change when it's not an endangered language. It has to do with imperfect learners of those languages. So I think these two claims, one that you can get irregular sound changes, and the other that you can get unnatural sound changes that wouldn't probably take place in fully viable languages. I think they're both very interesting claims, and I think they need a lot more investigation. Okay, so what about some contributions to historical linguistics from language documentation? There must be hundreds of examples of this around. I'll just tell you some from my own work. I guess I like them because I run into them. So Shinken is a small family in Guatemala, 4 languages down in the southeast of Guatemala. And the way this goes is that after we collected all of the lots and lots of lexical material in the documentation, we discovered that virtually all the words in these languages that have to do with agriculture, particularly for cultivated plants, are borrowed from neighboring Mayan languages. We wouldn't know that if we hadn't done the documentation, of course. But we infer from that that the Shinken speakers were not agriculturalists until they got these agricultural things, agriculture and the names that go with it, from their Mayan neighbors. Well, there's a moral to this beyond just that they borrowed a bunch of terms for agriculture. The fieldwork actually started in the 70s, and we just barely finished the documentation. Well, we haven't finished it. We finished it, but it's not all published yet, the documentation project for Shinken now. So Humaitepec, that language we were looking at, this thing goes nuts if I go backwards, so let me start it again. So Humaitepec is spoken on top of a volcano. I discovered it in the 1970s. Nobody knew this language existed. It's actually, there's a little town up here. These are fairly big. This is a fairly big bunch of trees and woods. And there's coffee growing all around the volcano. It's not a huge volcano, but it's bigger than you'd imagine. It takes probably a good part of a day to walk up it, which I've done a few times. Anyway, that's part of language documentation too, right? To figure out what the languages are and find the new ones and then document if you can. So we were talking about Humaitepec a little bit earlier. Well, the finding of these loanwords in Shinken languages about agriculture and the claim that they got agriculture from their Mayan neighbors has impact on this claim that many of you may know about the farming language dispersal model from Lord Coleman Renfrew and Peter Bellwood. If you haven't heard of this, I'll try to tell you a little bit about it, oversimplified of course. Their claim is that the big language families of the world diversified and spread because of agriculture. They get agriculture, and then people can reproduce very successfully, and soon they exceed the carrying capacity of the land, and so they go out and take their neighbor's land and push the neighbors out and put their agriculture and their genes and their people on that land. So that's how languages spread, because agriculture drives it. There's a problem with it, and they see this as what drives Indo-European, Austronesian, and Bantu. And basically, most of the big language families that have a widespread, they see agriculture as the driving force. Well, in the case of the Xinca case that we just looked at, if they borrowed all their agricultural terms, and they're agriculturalists today, but they weren't agriculturalists before they borrowed all of that, then there's just sitting there, the Mayans didn't wipe them out. Agriculture spread from one group to the next, but it wasn't that the groups spread and just took over, wiped out the languages and the people that spoke them. So this is an important case then, this discovery that from the documentation of these languages we can hypothesize that Xincan speakers got agriculture from Mayan speakers, but they didn't lose their languages and their territory. The agriculture spread to them, but didn't wipe them out, as the model predicts that it should. So that's one case of what we can get out of documentation, for the kind of historical contributions we can get out of language documentation. Here's one that I really like because it's fairly recent. This is work of mine and some others, graduate students and colleagues in the Chaco in Argentina. We work in a place called Misión La Paz in Argentina, in Salta province. It's on the Pilcomayo River, right across the river from Paraguay, and about 20 kilometers from Bolivia, so it's way up in the northern corner of Argentina. When we started, there were about 650 people in town. Now there are about 850. And there are 3 indigenous languages spoken there: Chorote, Niuacle, and Huichi. These all belong to the Matacoan family, but they're not closely related. They're on the order of Germanic, something like English and German, at least, in that much distance. So you can't understand one just because you speak the other. You have to learn them. So that's the context for this. The 3 indigenous languages plus Spanish in this place. Here's another map from Ethnologue showing these languages way up in the upper corner of Argentina. So what's important here is the context of language choice and language use. So here, there are multilingual conversations going on all day. And most people in conversations aren't speaking the same language. So I speak to you in my language and you speak back to me in your language, and it's not the same language most of the time. This has been called duolingualism. And it says here, this is unlike any other multilingual situation, not because of the duolingualism. There are some other duolingualisms around that you all probably could name and point at. Most of them are not institutionalized and radically stable like they are here. But what makes this unique is the linkage of the duolingualism with linguistic exogamy. So here you have to marry someone that speaks a different language. There are 3 languages in town, and if you're born there, you have to marry somebody who speaks another language. But a bunch of Huichi people moved in because of floods, and they were already married to other Huichis. And so it's an absolute rule, but if you move in, you kind of slide past it. So what happens is that spouses speak to each other in different languages as well, and a spouse never accommodates to the other spouse's language. This is just a pretty unique case. Let me give you a typical situation here. This is an extended household, so this is a typical couple. Elitye speaks Chorote, and he understands these other languages. So he speaks Chorote to his wife Anita, and actually to everybody else in the world. Anita, his wife, speaks Niuacle back to him. She understands these other indigenous languages, but doesn't know Spanish. And so they're having their bilingual conversation all the time. The household has other people living in it. So this is their youngest son. This is Franco, and his wife Valeriana. And Franco speaks Chorote to Valeriana and to everybody. He also understands these other languages. Valeriana speaks Wichi to Franco and everybody, but she also understands the other languages. And in fact, everybody speaks everything to everybody. Let me change that. Everybody makes a choice. They identify with one language and they speak that to everybody, regardless of what the other people speak back. So in this household and most other households, there are trilingual conversations going on all day long in all of one's life. Well, so that's the setup. So there's some important kinds of historical linguistic things that we get from doing this documentation of the three languages and documenting the very situation of language choice and language use in this community. You all probably know the claim, and it's not a bad one, that says that when languages are in intensive contact, you expect them to somehow become more similar to each other so that they converge in structure in some way, or they at least start sharing more structural things. And I just quoted Eichenwald just to pick on somebody, could have quoted dozens of different people having said something like that. People observe that, in the case of India that everyone knows about, there are well-known cases from Gumberts and Nadkarni and others where languages from different language families, but in intensive multilingual settings, simply change so that in these cases, even though the languages aren't related, it becomes possible to translate every morpheme by morpheme by morpheme, completely isomorphic structure between the languages. And a lot of people expect that's what you should get if you have an intensive language contact like we have in Mission La Paz. But is it so? So it raises the question, do these three languages in Mission La Paz show evidence of change towards convergence, towards structural, sharing more structure? And the answer is no. And because it's no, this topic really deserves a lot of investigation. Let me give you some examples of that. Not only is it no, that they're not converging, but in fact, they're diverging in some cases. And so here are a few cases of the divergence. So all of these languages have or had voiceless L as a phoneme in the language. And Chorote, one of the three, so here's Niuacle Flup and Wichi Flup, and Chorote has Lop, where Chorote has changed. So if the thing is in the middle, the voiceless L's become a cluster of a velar fricative and a voiced L. And if it's at the beginning of a word or at the end of a word, it just becomes a plain L. So Lop instead of Flop. Well, if these guys are in intensive contact all day long in these multilingual conversations, you would not expect one of them to sort of take its own path and go over there and lose its voiceless L's. You'd imagine that they would all simply converge structurally and keep their voiceless L's. So here's another case. So all of these languages had or have a contrast in the first person plural for inclusive versus exclusive. And I'll show you some examples. So Niuacle and Wichi have this. Chorote's lost it. So if you say Casplis, this is our language, meaning all of our language. But if you say Capriches, this is our language but not yours, so it's exclusive. And the same with the verbs, we kill it, all of us kill it, versus we kill it but you're not part of the killing. Well, Chorote has simply lost this contrast. It doesn't have it at all. It simply has one we. It doesn't have an inclusive, exclusive we. Incidentally, if you look at this, you can see that here's a cognate cliche and le. So you can see they're absolutely closely related, right? If you look at the prefixes and stuff, you can also see that they're not absolutely closely related languages. They're related, but not. Well, you can see the cognates, plan with lan and cliche with le, but they're not closely related. So again, this should be unexpected. You shouldn't expect that if the other languages that you're in daily communication with every single day of your life maintain this contrast between inclusive and exclusive, that one of the languages should just go off and lose this contrast. So divergence again. Here's another one. How are we doing on time?
It's about 7:40, 15, 20 minutes.
Oh, we'll get through all before that. So there's a morpheme, there's a clinic called perspective, which sort of means it's like a future, except it also means things like intention and do things on purpose and stuff like that. It's more aspect than tense, but it's called a perspective, and it's often translated as a future. Anyway, in this language, Chorote, and in other dialects of Niuacle, there's this kind of interesting wrinkle that if you put this clitic for the perspective on a verb, then you have to put the stative prefixes. You can't put the active prefixes on it. So these languages are active, inactive, or more precisely, active, stative languages. So the trick is if there's an event, if something happens. So I hunt and gather, that's an event, something happens, and so you put the for the first person active, for I, on it. Well, the same verb, it's still an active verb, it's still an event, but if you put the IE clitic on it, then you can't use the I anymore. You have to go to this unexpected stative, which looks kind of odd. The thing is, though, that the other languages and the other dialects have this constraint on which set of pronouns can occur with the perspective. But in the main dialect of Niuacle and Mission La Paz, they simply lost that. So they make all active verbs active. So here they have the cognate with this IE is chayu. And when you put the perspective on a verb in the Abimeño dialect of Niuacle, that's the local dialect, then you don't switch to the stative one at all. You can't. It's ungrammatical. You just keep it as an active verb. And the fact that all the languages they're in contact with have this difference between the verbs with the perspective and the real active verbs, and Niuacle doesn't have it, is again a case where Niuacle has simply gone its own way and has diversified from these other languages. Okay, well, so what do we make of this? Well, in short, if you had a strong claim that said you must expect some kind of structural similarity among languages that are in intense contact, that simply wouldn't play, right? It would just be wrong if you made such a strong claim. So cases like the one we just looked at in Mission La Paz mean that we really need to investigate these kinds of situations. We need to document the social context, the cultural social context in which these languages are used. We also need to document the linguistic differences that these languages have in order to figure out what has gone on historically, to find out what these changes are, and then to find out something, hopefully, or at least get a better perspective on what happens in multilingual situations, what happens in language contact when languages are changing. Probably no one would come to this situation and expect these languages never to become more similar, and in fact to become more divergent. So this makes this kind of documentation a fairly important thing to keep in mind, to look at. So there's some broader implications of the Mission La Paz situation. You've probably got the game plan now that you look at the changes and you look at what it means for general claims out there. So there's some claims about, there's a huge literature about trying to correlate genes with languages, and the main thing that goes on in a lot of the genetic research is an assumption that there should be parallel descent between languages and genes. That is, that the historical trajectories should be one-to-one, they should correspond, and it shouldn't be the case that the language has one history that's totally separate from the genetic history or vice versa. Well, obviously if you get these situations of linguistic exogamy, like here, where every individual has several languages, then there's not going to be a one-to-one correspondence between language and genes. And so there are complications for this fairly general assumption most biologists, maybe weakening a bit now, but most of the biological literature that does correlations between languages and genes has had as its strong tradition that you should not expect admixture in the language. You should not expect languages to shift, or you should expect the population to keep its genes, which it has to, and to keep its language, not change its language in any particular way. So these situations of linguistic exogamy have consequences for claims about how to correlate human biology with languages, and through that, figuring out more about the history of humankind. So I guess I said all of that about the assumption of parallel transmission. Let's do one last case from Mission de Paz, because I like this. So there's lexical borrowing. What happens here is that these languages don't like lexical borrowing. They borrow very, very little from Spanish and from each other. When they want to get new words for acculturation, they simply use their internal resources to create the new words. Here are some of the ways they do it. Maybe the biggest one is there's this derivational suffix, tah in Niuacle, and some different suffixes in the other languages. So it means something like similar to. So you borrow a goat from the Spanish speakers, and then you just create a new word for goat. So there's this kind of deer, tashinsha, and if you put the tah on it, you come up with tashinsta. And now you've got, it's a deer-like thing, and now you've got a new word for goat. And there are hundreds of words in the language that are like this for new items that come in. And then there's another one. Well, here's another example for matches. So matches are just fire-like things. You just take fire and put the suffix on it. Another way of doing it is by onomatopoeia. There aren't huge numbers of these, but there's some. So my favorite is motorcycle. And then you can do it by metaphor or description. So I like this one. The word for soldier or policeman is an ant, because they think soldiers walk in single file. And the word for bicycle, which is borrowed in lots of languages, isn't borrowed here. They just took the word for spider and applied it to bicycle. And the logic, I've heard two stories. One is that the wheels look like spider webs. And the other version is that people look gawky sitting on their bicycle. They got elbows and knees, and they look like spiders. In any case, whatever the metaphor, whatever the stimulus is, they have done this, and this is the way. So they avoid lexical borrowing. And I speculate about why would they avoid lexical borrowing, or how can they avoid lexical borrowing. This is wild speculation, but let's hear it anyway. So could the absence of loans be due in part to the fact that because people understand the various languages, but they choose not to speak any, they choose to speak only one of them forever. They identify with one and speak only one to everybody. Could it be that it has something to do with that? So if borrowing, lexical borrowing, is usually associated with multilingual speakers, speaker bringing a word from one language, one of the languages that he or she speaks, into another language that he or she speaks, if that's what we usually expect, could it be that if they do not actually speak the other languages, they just understand them around them all the time, could it be that that's why they're not borrowing at all? Could it be that you probably need to be saying these things in another language before you actually take it from that other language and bring it into your own? I mean, why, if you never pronounce a word in another language, why would you then take that word and put it in your own language, right? So that's my speculation, that maybe this linguistic exogamy and dual lingualism together somehow feed this lack of borrowing. Of course, it might be they just have a long cultural tradition of not borrowing anything. So I already said this about how important it is to document cases like this, to look at the kinds of historical contributions that we can get from our language documentation projects. Let me try to do something that might not work, but I'm going to try it anyway. I think there must be better cases than I came up with for how our historical linguistic work can inform and help our language documentation projects and language revitalization. When Karen Rice gave her talk, she was showing us how the older material from Petito was used in one of the Delene Athabascan community to answer questions that the residents there wanted answered. So the historical look at the documentation helped community members with things they wanted to do with their languages. I'll give you this one last case here. So this is about Tunica. Tunica is an isolate from Louisiana that's now dead. There are no speakers who have been native speakers left. You might more generously call it a sleeping language or a dormant language or a silent language or something like that. Because the speakers are trying to revive this language, there's a revitalization program that's got lots of people involved. The main sources for Mary Haas, from her work in the 50s, and she worked with the last speaker, Yushigan, and here he is. Excuse me. And she said of Yushigan that he hadn't spoken the language for 20 years. Indeed, I often had the feeling that the tunica grooves in Yushigan's memory might be compared to the grooves in a phonograph record, for he could repeat what he had heard, but was unable to make up new expressions of on his own accord. So this sounds like a definition of a semi-speaker, or at least someone who had undergone a lot of attrition in his language use over the years. And it turns out that Haas's description of the tunica verb is a verb agreement is, it's just confusing and it's wrong. Not her fault, though. Yushigan as a semi-speaker just hadn't learned it. So a student in Hawaii, Raina Heaton, went back to Albert Gatchett's field notes from the late 1800s. Gatchett was a very famous person in American Indian linguistics. If you get into that history, you'll see his name and see the kinds of things he did. He worked on tunica. He recorded something like 110 sentences, a couple of very short texts, and then he has full verb paradigms for a lot of verbs. And Heaton did a kind of a historical linguistic philological investigation of his field notes, and she discovered that tunica really is an active state of language, almost exactly like the ones we were looking at in the Chaco, and that the verb agreement system is just very different from what Haas had, and that's because Yushigan had just never learned it. So this information now about a more logical, rational verb system is what's informed the Tunica Revitalization Project in terms of how you create materials for learners. So let's look at the data. So here's Tunica rediscovered via Gatchett's notes, as Raina Heaton did. If you look at these two kinds of intransitive verbs, you'll see that if an event happened, if something happened, an active verb, then you get this suffix ni for I fell. But if nothing happened, if it's inactive, stative, then you get this prefix ich for I. So you get the two differences. And now you look at the transitive verb, the suffix for the subject of the transitive, I saw him, is exactly the same as the subject of the active verb, ni, but the subject of the object of the transitive verb, he saw me, has this ich, which is exactly the same as the subject of the inactive or stative verb. So Tunica had a rather straightforward active stative verb alignment, which didn't show up in Haas's description. In Haas's description, she said that there were about 20 verbs in a closed class of stative verbs, whatever. And she described these as taking the equivalent of inalienable prefixes. So if you look at the noun possession, you get a bunch of prefixes for alienable. So, so my hand, inalienable, has a different thing on it from my axe, which is alienable. It's not part of you. And it's the same set of possessive prefixes are the ones that show up in the verbs. So the equivalent of the inalienable possession versus the alienable possession shows up as the subject markers on the verbs, which is what we saw before. So the analysis of the old material on Tunica shows the inflection of stative verbs using the subject affixes equivalent to the alienable prefixes as opposed to the inalienable affixes, which is what Haas had. which match the object agreement markers on transitive verbs and renders the verb agreement system of Tunica understandable. If you didn't follow that, the punchline is that there's a really clear verb alignment and agreement system that Haas's informant wasn't able to give her. And once we rediscover that by doing some philological historical work on the earlier text, then we can bring that into our documentation and particularly our revitalization projects. So historical linguistics should be able to help us also with our ongoing revitalization projects. So we go to the conclusions. Without documentation of endangered languages, we stand to lose a lot. We have already lost a quarter of the languages of the world, the language families of the world. With documentation, we gain a lot, including access to a lot of linguistic history about languages, as we've seen in some of the examples here. We learn about language change, specific change. We can find out about specific changes through our language documentation projects. We find out patterns of borrowing, changes that are due to language contact, and things like that. We can, as in the Chaco case, we look at patterns of borrowing and the implications they have for general claims such as the farming language dispersal claim or the one-to-one match between genes and languages in history. We gain insights on claims about language change in multilingual situations, about language contact in general. We get an understanding of unique patterns of language choice and usage, or use, as in the case we saw in the Chaco with linguistic exogamy and duolingualism. And these, again, have implications for other things, other claims about history of language. Historical investigation of earlier documentation can help us recover aspects of the grammar that might not show up in some cases, as in the Tunica case, where we could use the results of the historical study to inform the revitalization situation. This is some preaching. Those doing language documentation should be aware of and attend to possible historical linguistic contributions of their work, so information of the sorts of things we've been talking about doesn't get lost, it doesn't get missed. So the documentation people ought to be alert for historical things. And linguists in general should be aware of the implications and the contributions of language documentation towards historical linguistics. So historical linguists ought to, another typo, historical linguists ought to also be aware of the possibility that documentation can inform them in their field as well. And the last one, to emphasize, this is going to be a sales pitch, to emphasize the importance of the value of the catalog of endangered languages, which is where some of this information is coming from that I was giving you. This was a project that was supported by the National Science Foundation, and it's a collaborative project between the University of Hawai'i, Manoa, and Eastern Michigan University. The website was designed by Google's benevolent wing. It's at, they won't give you any money, don't ask me. They give no money to anybody. They helped us build the platform, but they didn't give us any money. You can go to the website and look at all of these things. It's important to enlist your help on this catalog. This is a project that's ongoing, and it has pretty good information on most of the endangered languages of the world, but there are cases where we simply don't have enough of the information we need about numbers of speakers and what domains the language is used in, and whether the language is being transmitted to the next generation and things like that. If you have information, you should go to the catalog and see what it says about languages you know about, and if you have good information that's not there or corrections to make, please send it. It's very easy to do. There's buttons you can push to send this stuff, and we'll get it all fixed. Of course, we have to vet everything you send, and it goes out to a bunch of specialists to see whether what you wanted us to change is going to get changed or not. But this is really important for everybody involved, because this is where we will both find out about, we'll have the resources for people to make choices about the kind of documentation or work they're going to do with endangered languages, and also just have that catalog as complete and successful as possible for all audiences as well, with all sorts of interest in endangered languages. And that's it. Thank you very much.
We are recording these events, including your questions, so please don't ask the questions until you have the microphone in your hand. And also remember there will be a reception following the question and answer period over in the business school courtyard. So.
Thanks, Lyle. I was very interested by the opportunity discussion, and I wonder, so I totally agree with your general conclusion and point. I wonder if you'd be willing to take an even stronger line as follows. So you said it was no criticism of Mary Haas, but I actually wonder if you'd be willing to say that, to offer criticism. Because I've always thought that her, when she first trained most Americans of the mid-20th century, the 20th century, I've always thought it was a defect of her pedagogy that her students were resolutely anti-philological, and they would do, for example, a grammar of Riyadh without consulting all the other very extensive material that previously existed. I've always assumed that it was part of Sapir's training of his students that they were supposed to ignore, as people always do in the theoretical paradigm, that they were supposed to ignore all the previous literature. And so it's interesting to see that she herself did that. So I wonder if you think it's just kind of a mistake that she made, or if that actually was a principle, or if others not so much.
That's a good point. I hadn't actually considered that, but you could definitely consider that. You might even put it in a slightly broader context that Boaz trained them all, Sapir trained Mary Haas, and they all were trained in that tradition that said, there have been so many wacky claims by armchair linguists, don't generalize, go out and get the data, and eventually we'll be able to generalize after we get the data. So they were all trained to not look at any other, not be influenced by any other views of how language might work, to take every language as though it were potentially unique. Of course they didn't, but they were trained to do that. And I wonder if that would explain why you would just not look at other sources, because you would not want to bias what you might come up with in your own solution. But yeah, it's a good point. There was that going on. Yeah, thanks.
I was wondering, in linguistically exogamous marriages, whether the kids tend to use the mother's language or the father's, or if it just depends.
It's a good question. I kind of ducked it because there's a lot to say about it. What happens is that these families are fairly big, they have lots of kids, and the kids pick one or the other of the parents' language, so they don't usually pick the third language as the one they're going to identify with. It seems to work like this. Along about age 6 or so, they simply decide, this is my language, I'm going to identify with this, and I'm not going to speak the other one ever again, and they don't, mostly. We've done a demography of this town 3 times now. It's not a big town, and we know everybody in town, and the vice chief goes out and does the demography for us. But everybody in town knows what everybody else speaks, so it's not that hard to get this done, or what language they identify with. And it turns out that none of the social-linguistic things you would imagine might be determining this are at play. So it has nothing to do with the gender of the parents, nor the gender of the child. It has nothing to do with prestige, because that question doesn't even compute. They think there's something wrong with you imagining that one language might have more value somehow than another. They just can't fathom how that could be. At least that's our experience with them. Well, usually the kinds of answers we get, and we've asked people over and over and over, how did you decide this language and not the other one? And they almost always say, well, some sort of aesthetic reason. Well, I liked it better. It felt more comfortable. It seemed more like me. That sort of thing. I mean, not concrete stuff. And in each family, there tend to be kids that identify with one language and other kids that identify with the other. So that, well, 2 of my main consultants have, I think one has 6 kids, and 2 of his kids speak his language, and 4 of them speak the mother's language. And the other one, it's I think 4 kids, and they're split right down the middle. And those are just 2 families of many. And so that's all I can tell you about that. I can tell you much more, but that's enough.
That was louder than I thought. Do you think there's any tension in linguistics between documentation and revitalization programs inspired by the the needs of historical linguistics versus documentation and revitalization programs inspired by what communities are seeking out linguists and so on. I guess the question is, how should we, with limited grant money and limited linguists and a lot of languages that need to be studied and documented, how should we prioritize? Should we look for communities that really want to get a program like this going, or should we prioritize languages that are from lesser known families or have less accurate documentation available?
Yeah, well, that's a kind of question that's been asked a few times at the Institute already. I don't think there's a single answer. There may be many answers. It may depend on you as an individual, and it may depend on the community you go to. But just in general, if you look at people, our heroes, Bloomfield and Sapir were documenting languages, but they're also doing historical linguistics on those same languages. And that's kind of been the tradition in a lot of the Americas and parts of Africa and Australia, that people do both. They do documentation and they do historical. And you can kind of weigh yourself whether you're going to put more into historical or not. And some people won't put anything into it because they won't have the skills, won't have had the time to learn it. And other people will put a lot into it. I would imagine that the best of all worlds for your intellectual satisfaction and for the good of the world would be for you to do the documentation and to try to get the historical linguistic juice you can out of those situations at the same time. But I don't think there's any magic answer that you must do one or you must do the other. Maybe we can talk more about it.
I think I'm a choir boy, so you don't have to preach to me. I'd like to push you a little bit. I mean, one of the things I found in South America is that really the linguistic history is some of the best history we have, which actually a lot of historians would be surprised at somehow. The historical record is, the linguistic record is actually one of the best sources that we have for much of the Amazon to see what's actually happening. I want to make a little bit of a puzzle.
I thought you were going to say the Andes.
There's a bit of a puzzle that I had about your Shinkan Mayan example about the Bellwood hypothesis. I mean, you're not saying that the Mayans didn't expand because of agriculture. Because that, I mean, if all the Mayans had borrowed the words from Shinkan, but had expanded prior to borrowing those words, that would have been the strongest conclusion.
I didn't follow that. Say that last part again.
Well, you said Shinkan took agriculture from the Mayans, and that's kind of an argument against the dispersal hypothesis.
Yeah.
But it's not that Mayan didn't expand itself into all these regions because of...
Yeah. Well, we know a lot about the history of Mayan, and in fact...
Yeah, it has nothing to do...
Well, we sort of have very good hypotheses about where they started and how much they expanded, and they didn't expand a whole lot. Neither did Mihisoki, and there are agricultural groups that are just content to give adequate resources to just sit there and not do very much. And a lot of Mesoamerica seems like that. I mean, almost all the families in Mesoamerica got agriculture from somebody else, but they didn't get wiped out. Now, there are groups that were very expansive. The Aztecs were pushing language all over the place and things like that. But it's not clear that the Mayans were expanding into new territory in any very significant way. In any case, whether they were or not, it's pretty clear that in this case, the model would predict that Xinca shouldn't get agriculture, it should just be wiped out, and that somebody with agriculture should move in and take over their territory.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. I should preface this by saying I am a researcher on child language acquisition. I don't know very much at all about your specialties, but I have a question about language revitalization and sort of what counts as success. So I've heard of cases where people were trying to revive a language that had been dead for quite some time. I mean, have there been successes in such cases, or if not, what are some of the successes, and what What are they like?
Right. Well, thanks. That's a pretty good question. Not one I was anticipating. Yeah, sure. There are situations where dead languages have been revived, and they've been revived at different levels. So Hebrew is the one that everybody mentions, but you can look at Cornish, where Cornish had no speakers, and now there are clubs and pubs where you must pass tests in Cornish in order to become a member, and there are lots and lots of speakers. There's Manx where there were no speakers, and now there are a bunch of speakers. And those people get very offended if you say that their language is extinct. We need a category that does something. We need a category of sort of formerly of non-continuous transmission, that the language had no native speakers but was somehow revived. Now the question is, how revived are they and how long are they going to last? Is Manx or is Cornish, is that simply a social, is that just a bunch of clubs and they're going to die in the next generation because they still have all the same impact from English and other things? Or is it going to really expand out and become the dominant language of those people? There are some reasonably successful cases in some of the American Indian groups, but success there is in the eye of the beholder. It's like, how many people have to have done this before you count? There's Darrell Baldwin in Miami, where his whole family spoke Miami, and fairly successfully. It's one family in a whole group. Well, there are others trying to learn the language, but I consider that a success story. The community considers it a success story. But complete success might be that you have to have a whole community conversing daily in that language. I'll give you another sort of case of language success being in the eye of the beholder. So Jay Powell was hired by the Quileute tribe to go up and do a revitalization project. This was quite a while ago. And there were only a couple of elderly female elders that spoke the language. And it's a very, very tough language anyway. I mean, you know, lots of morphology and lots of phonology and stuff like that. And so after a while, it just became really hard for kids to learn, even though Jay, the linguist, was producing material and trying to do it. So what the community came up with was this pidgin Quileute, where they decided, okay, you will just speak English, but we'll put Quileute words in it. And that was a success story for them because that's exactly what they wanted. They wanted to recover their sense of their tradition, their lost heritage, and a positive feel about themselves. And if that's what they wanted, that's exactly what they got from that project. Now, linguists would probably say that was not a success story because, you know, using English with Quileute words is kind of an insider, in-group self-identity kind of thing is not what we imagine revitalization of a whole language for a whole community is. So you can sort of emphasize the positive parts even though there aren't so many speakers, or you can emphasize the less positive parts. And of course, there are lots of success stories, very few actually, but there are more than you might imagine, and we really like to talk about those when communities want to see a model of some other community that has not necessarily become extinct, but has had very few speakers and then have turned the tide and have reversed the language shift. Those are the kind of success stories that we want to let everybody else know about, so they know that it's possible and they can do the things that work and perhaps not do the things that don't work.
I have a question regarding the situation in Mission Navas that you talked about. So you argued that the reason why there aren't many borrowings across those languages is because of that situation of dual lingualism, not full bi or multilingualism. So I imagine that many of those people there also speak Spanish, and that would be more like bilingualism than I can imagine. So are there many loanwords from Spanish in those languages?
Yeah, that's a really interesting case, a good question. I should preface this by saying I was speculating wildly about what might account for the fact that they don't borrow. It may just be that traditionally they never borrowed, so they don't start borrowing now. But I was speculating that if they never speak these other languages, if they just hear them all the time, then there wouldn't be much of an excuse for taking a word from some other language and putting it into your own if you actually aren't pronouncing those words. But yeah, the case of Spanish is interesting because most of the older women don't speak Spanish at all. The older men speak it, some don't speak it very well at all. But all the young people under about age 30 speak Spanish reasonably well. That is, they've all gone to school and they know Spanish. And it turns out, so when we first started working on the language, we were working only with elders, as linguists often do, because they have free time and they were slightly better speakers. And we'd get these texts, and in over 1,000 lines of text, you'd get like one Spanish loanword or something like that. Well, I'm used to working in Central America where 500 loanwords is just not, it's not shocking at all. It's sort of what you expect. You just imagine that a whole bunch of plants and animals are going to be loanwords from Spanish. You just expect that to be the case in Latin American Indian languages, in lots of regions, but not here. And so, what are we getting? Well, it turns out that these younger speakers, the very youngest ones, they're not saying the words that the old guys are saying for school and church, well, church maybe, school and book, and I mean, they have native words for everything, for television and telephone and all that. But the younger guys are actually throwing more and more Spanish in. Not huge amounts, but lots more than the older guys were. So I suspect that because of exactly what you're saying, that this amount of Spanish bilingualism is also then triggering more loanwords in their use of the language. So the situation I was talking about was pretty much the documentation from this older generation, not from the younger generation, the youngest generation. And it would be interesting to do that study, which we haven't done, to see just how many loanwords might turn up in text from them. Quite a few more than original. I think we found 16 loanwords from Spanish in like 20 or 30 texts. I mean, just very few. Thanks. From the old guys.
Okay, so please join us over at the business school for the reception, and thank you all.